episode 66 of The Bar is Ankle High. I'm Katie, and today I'm joined by Jamie, the neurodivergent nurse. Thank you so much for helping us out during Garrett's maternity leave. I really, really appreciate it.
I'm so honored, as always. Whenever you ask me to be on, this is always my favorite time.
Oh, good. Because we were like looking at our timeline and I was like, I don't think that Garrett is ready to come back from maternity leave yet and record something, and we need something for November. So but we're here today because I found this article that I had sent to you, and I apologize, folks, if you hear rattling in the background. One of my cats is on one this morning, and there's nothing to be done. But the vet says she's fine. So I found this Washington Post article titled, Scientists Discover How Dozens of Genes May Contribute to Autism. And I thought of you, even if Garrett was back already, to have on to discuss this, because the last time you were on, or one of the last times you were on our show, we were discussing that 23andMe claim and how they said that they could like screen for ADHD with a 23andMe test, which we had like a discussion on the ethical issues with that, and, you know, potentially like that being used in like health insurance and life insurance determinations. So this article like caught my eye. It came into my email through like the daily roundup emails that all those news publications send. And so as I was reading it, I do want to say at the top, I don't personally believe that autism spectrum disorder is something that needs to be cured or something to be ashamed of. But I do think it's worthwhile, like most things, to know what causes it, and by finding out what causes any condition, you can figure out better ways to cope and better ways to treat it if that's something you want to do. So with that being said, there's this quote from the end of that Washington Post article that I'm just going to drop in now because I think it's important. So they said, experts stress that autism is not one disease, but a group of disorders. The neuron imbalance is only one of multiple possible causes. Many people with autism, for example, have defects in the microglia cells that regulate brain development, injury repair, and maintenance of the networks that process information. And genes alone cannot account for autism, said Yale's McPartland. It's complicated and it's fascinating. You can have autism in identical twins, and they almost always will both have autism, but not always. Jennifer Singh, an autism expert and associate professor in the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Institute of Technology, said too much money has been poured into searching for the genetic underpinnings of autism spectrum disorder. Singh pointed to a 2018 report by a federal advisory committee, which found 60% of the funding for autism research addressed the biology and risk factors, but only 2% dealt with, quote, lifespan issues, unquote, for people living with the spectrum of disorders. Which is why when I was looking into this study and this article, I thought it was interesting at what they actually found and how they linked it. So have you done any research into like the causes of like neurodevelopmental disorders and like autism?
Yeah. On the last episode that I was on with you and Garrett, we talked about neurodivergence in general, right? That there's all these things that contribute to being neurodivergent, which includes ADHD as well as autism. Like we're all part of that cluster per se, that spectrum. And we obviously know that there is a genetic familial link whenever it comes to some type of neurodivergence. But there's also contributors of environmental factors as well that can alter the DNA whenever the baby is in utero and things like that. So it's a combination of what actually causes this type of developmental change per se versus the typical standard development of the brain.
Yeah. And that's what this study, so this study was done by Stanford University researchers and was published in the Journal of Nature. And they simulated brain development in a petri dish, which was interesting to me. And they mentioned in the article that they were, quote, ethical objections to traditional studies on brains. And I was like, well, that's a weird way of putting it, but I guess like the Frankenstein's monster version, because the bigger issue is that a lot of the way that they've been able to examine brains of people with ASD is post-mortem, but they were able to like slap all these cells into a petri dish and then see how they react. So they also in this study classified, they were talking about autism spectrum disorder, ASD, but they also kind of generally called it a neurodevelopmental disorder, which would include those of us with ADHD, for example. And but they also noticed, which I didn't realize, but they noted that, and I'll get to this a little bit later, but there's a higher instance of epilepsy in people who have ASD, which I didn't realize, but it makes sense with everything else that this study kind of like gets into. So this study found that neurodevelopmental disorders like ASD were associated with abnormal cortical interneuron development. The previous studies done on this part of the brain found that defects in the development and function of things called GABAergic interneurons as being implicated in ASD and other neurodevelopmental disorders. That conclusion was primarily based on the high prevalence of seizures in epilepsy patients and neuroimaging studies that showed changes in interneuron density and morphology in postmortem ASD tissue. So that's how the researchers came up with their hypothesis, right, for the study.
Which, just to make it a little bit easier, so the GABA in your body, you've heard of restless leg syndrome, right? Yeah. So that's part of GABA. Like, you have too much firing, and so you have the pins and needles, you have that restless leg, and that's why a lot of those people, they take a medication called gabapentin or Neurontin, which slows down that firing so that you don't have that electricity sending out through those legs. So, just throwing out the big words and things, people are like, what does that even mean? So GABA is part of that too. So
that's also something that they think is or related to Parkinson's then, right? It's like the extra firing of those signals, and it's causing those tremors throughout your body.
Exactly.
Which I only know because at some point it was like pointed out, I don't know where, but it was something where it's like when you're falling asleep and like you suddenly twitch, it was like, that's how Parkinson's was described to me. Like that sudden twitching that you have no control over is Parkinson's, but all of the time, and not just once as you're trying to fall asleep, where one thing like breaks through your brain, suppressing all of that. So the researchers in this study identified 425 genes that had been identified in research happening over the past decade that were associated with ASD and neurodevelopmental disorders. So what they found was the opposite, or they didn't find this in this study, but what we know is that there's those GABA cells that are the firing cells, and interneurons are like the brake pedal and will interfere with the firing of those cells. And during late stage gestation and through the first 2 years of human life, those interneuron cells are generated in a deeper part of the brain, and they migrate to your forebrain cortex, which is responsible for like complex thought and language and emotional regulation, which we've definitely talked about before on the podcast with like our overactive amygdalas, basically. But these researchers were positing the idea that if these interneurons don't finish making that migration from inside the interior of your brain to this frontal lobe, this forebrain, then that's where you end up with this increased excitability, basically. And that's what can cause and contribute to symptoms, at least, of ASD and other neurodevelopmental disorders, which makes sense if you're thinking of like overstimulation and hyperactivity and impulsivity and things like that. If there's nothing, or you have fewer brake pedals to like rein you in, then you're going to be more impulsive and you're going to get overstimulated and overwhelmed by loud noises or like a crowded grocery store or something.
It's
So,
interesting to me because my background as a nurse for 10 years was neuro ICU. So neurology and neurosurgery has been my specialty. I love the brain so much. And while working in the neuro ICU, I remember the first time I had a patient who had a partial lobectomy because her seizures were so bad. And so I expected, if you take out a lobe of your brain, then if, let's say you have a stroke, right? Like you have a clot that occludes blood flow to your brain, you're going to have a deficit. You may not be able to move part of your body. You may have a facial droop. Your speech may be rough. But they take out this part of the lobe and they had no deficit. The brain completely rewired itself to make up for this missing piece. I can't completely understand, but I'm sure it goes along with like the neurotransmitters and such with the developmental process, but how it can do that in a 20-year-old. But in development, how it struggles with being able to make that new pathway, even though early on it's having these brake pedals or is having these issues with the communication and the wiring for the electricity in the brain. So it's just wild to me in general, like without getting into specifics.
I wonder if it's kind of like like the brain couldn't get out of its own way. So once you took the epileptic part of the brain out, then it was able to like do what it was trying to do the whole time, but they were just hitting like a dam and couldn't get through.
And so that makes me wonder for this as well, when it comes to ADHD, when it comes to autism spectrum disorder. I'm sure there are a lot of people who would choose to have a different type of brain. I joke around and I complain. Even this morning when I was getting ready to get on with you, and I kept hitting things, I'm like, I hate my brain. Like, why can't I be better? Why do I keep doing this to myself? But I wonder if the same thing with epilepsy, right? With people who are having seizures and they have a part of their brain removed so that it stops that. I wonder what it would do with the neurodivergence. Like, would that change? Because now you have communication where you're not having like that rapid fire because these two parts of your brain or sections aren't really getting along well. And so if you remove that part and you have no physical deficits, what would it do as far as ADHD or ASD?
It's interesting. We talked about that because Garrett did a 3-part series on depression this past summer. And on the 3rd episode, she was talking about different treatments. And one of them was the like shock therapy, and which I didn't realize was still a thing. But one of the risks is that you could have like personality changes. And we talked about, having that conversation with your partner and saying, like if PK came to me and said, I really think that I need this, like my depression is not getting better, it's treatment resistant. I've got all these things, and having that discussion of like, okay, but if you're going to be a totally different person than the person I fell in love with, like what are our rules for our relationship like going forward? Because I think that's such a huge risk. And I think I don't know that I would try brain surgery just to get around having ADHD, as frustrating as it is and as annoying as it is to try to find a pharmacy that has my medication. I don't know, like I still like who I am. So it's that kind of thing where, I mean, if it that would be a tough call. I would need to see more evidence of it working without deficits for people with ADHD. And also, I mean, if I was having seizures all the time, I would be way more willing to risk it than just, not doing the dishes and being bad at putting the laundry from the washer into the dryer.
Same. Especially now that we know that we have ADHD and we have so many tools to add to our toolbox,
Yeah,
unlike when I was 20, right? Like,
for sure.
life was so hard then because I didn't know, and I didn't know other people who, I didn't know that I had ADHD, but I didn't know other people who had similar issues that I had in general, in ways that they were more accomplished in ways to minimize the struggle that they had, that I could be like, oh, that worked for you. Let me try it and see if it works for me. I would not change any part of who I am today by going through things like that. But I can understand where people struggle. Medication doesn't help because roughly 20% of people medication is not effective for who have ADHD. I know we were talking about autism and stuff with this. But I mean, is their life so tough that they would want to make that change? I could see why that would be a great resource for them, because I know how safe lobectomies are because I've taken care of patients with that population. But I just wonder how much if that would be one of the things that would be beneficial for those types of symptoms that we experience.
Yeah, it definitely I think it raises an ethical question, because I always think of it in the context of like old asylums or like old timey true crime stuff, where you have these like horrible, these psychologists who thought they were doing well, but they were doing like, ice pick surgery on people. And like, it's just like the context of that. It's like, ooh, I don't know. Like, I want to be sure that we're not like accidentally like destroying people just because we think it's right. And, it just gives me so much pause, because it's also, the brain is so, I did like a science fair project on the brain in like 3rd grade, but it's just crazy to me that you can't tell the differences between the different parts of the brain, like without like a scan lighting up for different parts of the brain. But it's not like you open somebody's abdomen and you're like, there's a liver and there's the intestines and there's the bladder, and they're all separate and function separately, even though they're connected, and it's like a whole system. The brain, I mean, you sneeze while you're cutting into it, and all of a sudden the person doesn't know how to speak anymore. And so, that being said, the videos of doing surgery where people are like playing violin and stuff are just wild as well. So I don't know. The whole thing is just like so crazy. But in this study, they didn't have to cut into people's brains. So what they did was, did you look up the study?
With the CRISPR that was used?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was familiar with it because I read before an article in China that they were making like designer babies because they were able to go in with using the CRISPR technology, which stands for clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats.
Obviously. Yeah. What else?
I mean, I know you knew that. I didn't want to be so obvious, right? So they use like this gene editing system, which is what that is, to modify the genes in lab cells. And so they use an embryo, or at least they did before. So it's a similar thing that they used for this study, which is why when they were talking about it being unethical, I thought, I know that they also obviously are saying creating these designer babies with blonde hair and blue eyes, or that they have this type of, they're able to, even now with in vitro, they're able to say, hey, this is going to be a healthy zygote, right?
Yeah.
They go through the whole process. They can tell you how healthy they are. So yeah, I definitely looked into more of how they were utilizing that as well.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting because, like, for me, there's like, when I read these studies, there's these huge blocks of text where it's all different acronyms and decimal points and all these different things where I'm like, yada, yada, yada. I don't know what that means. It can't possibly be relevant. There'll be a summary after this, which is how legal writing is. So maybe that's just my professional tip. If you're ever reading a legal decision, you can usually just skim and get there's usually a summary paragraph somewhere in there. But so I was like reading it, and that it struck me as well when they were like, the Washington Post article mentioned like the ethical issues, and I was like, well, yeah, because we've talked about this before where it's like, well, I'm not going to volunteer my fetus if I'm pregnant to be subjected to some medication that they're like, don't take while pregnant, but they're just not because it definitely causes, birth defects or anything, but because we don't know. And so it's that sort of thing again, where it's like, well, I don't want to I don't want to find out by sacrificing my child. But there's that question of like, well, how can you test this then? Like, and what struck me from the study itself is that the um the brain development in lab rats completes by the time they give birth. So it's different than humans in that ours continues for the first 2 years of life with this migration of interneurons, of these brake pedal cells. So the researchers were able to use this CRISPR technology and basically have of these 425 genes that they had identified. They were basically had 425 petri dishes, and they made the genes, each one of the genes they were trying to test, glow. And the idea being that when they put the neural cells in these petri dishes, they automatically migrated towards each other, which was pretty cool. Because like you said, like that's what happened with the lobectomy, right? Like they automatically were drawn to each other. So these researchers made the specific gene that they were trying to isolate glow so they could see if it stopped that natural connection being made or if it didn't, if the connection kept going. I wrote, there were a lot of crazy acronyms in this section of the study. So it's linked in our show notes if you really want to know about that. The idea, though, being that if you have these interneurons not firing, then they're not inhibiting that excitation in the brain. And therefore, we have these for ADHD, we have overactive amygdalas that trigger that fight or flight response when we for sure don't need it, but again, causes epilepsy. So, so the point of this study, the idea being, if we can find a way to provide folks with more interneurons and encourage that natural migration of interneurons to the frontal lobe of the brain, then perhaps we can limit the effects of ASD and neurodevelopmental disorders in folks. Which again, I'm not saying it has to be cured. I'm just saying this is what the study said.
Well, I mean, in general, people who anticipate getting pregnant, women or AFAB, right, who anticipate having a child at some point, they take prenatal vitamins. And what is the whole purpose of that? Well, it's to prevent neural tube defects. And because while the child is developing, the baby that the person wanted to have is developing, you have to have a completion of the neural tube. And if you don't, then you have issues like Down syndrome. So I mean, they learned that this was something that would help and assist in preventing those types of developmental issues in women who are older or, have more of a risky pregnancy and things like that as well. So, I mean, we have that type of advancement for parents who have that desire and don't want to necessarily take that type of risk.
So do you think that this could be something that is like a folic acid vitamin or something that you would just take during pregnancy to kind of like boost your
I mean, as we're already talking, right? Like we know that if you take gabapentin, that it decreases that it goes into axial neurons and axon neurons and all kinds of stuff like that, like with the communication of the pathways of this electricity through your body and how the brain responds to it. But we know that if you take this one pill, that it slows those things down. It slows down the GABA in your body so you don't have that type of response. I don't even know if it would be something that is pre-pregnancy or while they are in utero, but I can see how that could help with the development too.
Mm-hmm.
If we know that a mom is at high risk, if they are able to link this genetic, because that's where they're going with more than environmental factors, right? That there's that development with, because they're cutting down your DNA into RNA to be able to isolate it. So, yeah, I think that at some point they may be able to figure out that if your child is at high risk for some type of neurodivergency from the familial link, that here's something that you could take that kind of changes the bit of development and helps with the development for a fully developmental brain that doesn't have these I don't want to say deficits because it sounds so bad, but I mean, really, that's what it is. Like, it's not this perfect, beautiful communicating brain. But if you knew that if you were going to have a baby with a club foot and your baby's still going to be great and they're still going to be able to do things, you would probably want your child not to suffer as much. And realistically, we do suffer with ASD, ADHD. There are struggles that, because we live in a society that's not made for us specifically. So I anticipate there's something that would be able to help with fully developmental brain in the future.
I think as much as that quote that I read in the beginning pointed out the difference in how research funding is apportioned for studying autism, I think the I guess perhaps risk of autism is that it is a spectrum disorder. You don't know how severe it will be. Same with Down syndrome. You can have significant cardiac issues if you have Down syndrome, or you can have none and you're fine. I mean, there's a gymnast who competes, at a very high level and happens to have Down syndrome, but does not have it so severely that she's not able to compete in competitive high level gymnastics. So I think, there is that idea where even if I'm going to cut down my child's suffering by half, at a certain point, once the die is cast, you can't undo it. But I think if there was a way to prevent, especially like you said, with a genetic link, like we know this is going to be something that you're at risk for passing to your child. It's not a congenital, roll of the dice. It just happens sometimes sort of thing where you would have no reason to suspect this would be a problem. Then yeah, I think you do get into that question of like, well, as much as I like who I am, if, my kid doesn't have to worry as much about struggling with, just school, like school is hard. And, if I can make their life a little bit easier, even if maybe they'll still have trouble sitting still in class, but they're not going to struggle as much with dyscalculia or dyslexia or any of these other things that we see with ADHD, then I can understand the parental desire to try to alleviate that for your kids.
Well, and just like you were saying too, and talking from a parental aspect, right, of anticipating what the difficulties that your future child would have to endure. You mentioned earlier in the show that even though autism itself does not affect life expectancy, research has shown that the mortality risk among individuals with autism is twice as high as the general population.
Yeah.
So even if it's not, hey, I don't want this personality, but if you know that they are more likely to die at a younger age, why would you not want an increased life expectancy as well for your potential child?
Yeah. So these researchers at Stanford were able to identify 46 genes total. They found 13 genes that prevented the interneurons from forming, and 33 genes that, when missing, prevented the interneurons from traveling to the cerebral cortex. So those were the ones that just completely stunted the migration that we need to have happen for normal, quote unquote, brain development. They also found one of the genes crucial to the migration of interneurons has been linked to seizure disorders, which supports the hypothesis that seizures result from too much excitation of neurons and too little inhibition of that excitement. My cousin, when we're recording, I just participated in like a 36-hour fundraiser for my cousin's son, Henry, who has a seizure disorder called alternating hemiplegia of childhood. And he was diagnosed at like 9 weeks old. He was super little, but he was born in January. So they were afraid to go outside. Like getting him to his doctor's appointments was terrifying because they knew that cold air would potentially trigger a seizure for him because his body didn't know how to react to just having cold air on his face. And like bath time, like, changes in temperature, his brain could not process that it wasn't a problem and it wasn't something that you needed to react to. And it was causing a lot of seizures for him. I mean, he still has seizures constantly, but at least, he's gotten better at not seizing with those types of transitions. But they're also trying to develop a treatment for him that would knock down this protein in his brain that is causing these seizures. So they do know what causes his seizure, but it's a similar thing. It just struck me when they were like saying that this one gene in particular can be linked to a seizure disorder with too much excitation. And it just reminded me of Henry and what especially was triggering his seizures when he was really, really little.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because there's so many different things that can cause, because when you think about seizures too are a spectrum, just like neurodivergence. It could be because the calcium channels don't allow enough calcium into the cells. It could be due to potassium, GABA. It could have a like cardiac issue that is causing seizure activity. Then other people, if you shine bright lights into their eyes, like phototherapy or blinking lights, that could induce a seizure. So it's very fascinating. I want to find out more exactly like what type of, exactly what the cause is for the epilepsy in ASD out of all the vast possibilities of it.
Yeah, it's, I think it's that one gene LNPK that they found. But I don't know that they were able to specifically say, because then again, I think it's that same thing where you have to find the candidates, and then I guess you would be able to do a spinal tap, right, to get a sample of cerebral fluid, or would you do like a
yeah, you can do a lumbar puncture to
yeah.
get CSF. You're exactly right.
But you'd still have to identify those folks. And then there's the question of like, do they have an autism diagnosis? Are they folks like us who are in their 30s finally getting diagnosed with some form of neurodivergence? And there's plenty of us, certainly on our Instagrams, who are, especially AFABs who are in our 30s and 40s getting diagnosed with autism for the first time. And yeah, it is interesting though. And I wonder like what the Venn diagram is of, because then you also have the question of like the chicken and the egg, right? For folks who have epilepsy, did you have epilepsy that ended up causing autism spectrum disorder, or was it the other way around? I don't know. I'm not that smart. That's someone else's job to figure out.
Well, I mean, it sounds like they don't know yet either, but it's just starting to go down that path. So in 5 years, we're going to revisit this and we're going to give all the answers that have been learned.
Exactly.
You're going to give the impression that's normally at the end of a scan or a court document.
Exactly. I'll have peaked if this podcast gets cited in some fuddy-duddy research paper where they're like, well, a few years ago, some idiot from New York was
And my
just
last
like,
name is Frejot, F-R-E.
I know you'll be by then. You might be running the study.
There you go.
But I did think that this was interesting too with the talk of excitation and the inhibition of that, because there's still that question of like, why do stimulants work for people with ADHD? If you're hyperactive, why is giving you something like street name speed, why does that like calm you down? And I think it didn't say this in the study from what I found, but I think it's because it gets our interneurons like excited to show up to work that day. And so
And it
those
helps with
guys,
the increase of dopamine uptake too, because we're
y-
still talking about all that, right? So like stimulants allow, because it causes it to be excited, just like you're saying, so that way it can have an uptick and it can get the dopamine that's there that it just normally doesn't, that most people have normally. But did
yeah,
you know that if you have too much dopamine receptors that you're firing in that way, that that's linked with schizophrenia? Like, so that's
really?
the opposite side of the spectrum. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Huh. I did not know that that was so too many dopamine receptors is linked to schizophrenia.
Yeah. Like, so, well, we have an issue with not enough, quote unquote, not enough dopamine. Like, it's not really an issue that we don't have enough dopamine. It's just how our brain processes it,
Yeah.
right? But for someone who has, quote unquote, too much dopamine, so their brain processes the dopamine quickly and more than a neurotypical brain, those are the people who have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is linked to it.
Wow, that's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. So is schizophrenia linked to um hallucinations, or is that just like a trope that I
No, they
associate with
definitely do.
schizophrenia? Okay.
It also depends on what type of schizophrenia, because you have like schizoaffective disorder. You have, so that too is a spectrum
Of course.
when it
Right.
comes to it. But yeah, they definitely have auditory. A lot of them have visual hallucinations as well. Mm-hmm.
And are they able to induce hallucinations in folks by giving them extra dopamine? Like, can they
I don't
tie that
know.
to the dopamine thing, or is it something else?
I have no idea. I
Mm.
just know that the medication that they end up giving them, a lot of times they hate being on it because it makes them feel like a zombie.
Mm.
Like they just don't have that normal feeling of life. They just turn into like a knot on a log, in my little southern example.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I'm familiar with that description. In my legal career, I've been to a few mental hygiene hearings where folks need a court order from the hospital to administer medication to folks who are refusing it, because they don't like how it makes them feel to be on this medication, but they're a ward of the state, so they just need a court order. But
and see,
that was
that's also the scary part of what you were talking about too, with all of this, right? Like, oh, is there a medication that could help? The way that our society and our political feelings are right now, like anything that's not falling into what society deems as normal,
yeah.
who's to say that they're not going to say people with ASD or ADHD, that they aren't more, we know there's substance abuse that is linked, right? Like
Mhm.
there's a higher chance of that. We are the ones who are into riskier behavior. We seek that adrenaline or whatever. Like, are they then going to say, hey, we have found that there's a link between these people that are criminals? Of course, not all criminals, but we're going to force them to take this medication out because they're actually a danger to society, when it's not true.
Yeah. Thankfully, the judge that I was just interning when I saw most of these cases, but the judge that I was interning for was pretty well, judicious, but his policy on that, his belief was that, you know, you're allowed to not take medication if you don't want it. Like it's really, are you violent if you're not on this medication? Like, do you actually, like, did you get picked up by the police because you were chasing a neighbor with a knife? well, then, yeah, that's a different question. Then we have, proof that you actually are a danger to other people around you. If you just want to, go and yell at the rain, you're free to do that, And so, he's the kind of thing where he's like, yeah, you can live your life the way you want to. And if you're at least lucid enough to make that choice yourself, and you can prove that you what day it is, where you are, then he was very, he wasn't particularly like trigger happy with issuing those orders. If he was issuing them, they were like extremely limited. But yeah, no, it's a real concern. And it's that kind of thing where, at what point, especially folks who don't have family and they don't have a POA or anything, where they've authorized to make these choices for them if they're not available. And then even with, like look at Britney Spears, not that right now in this moment is an excellent example, but she was under a conservatorship for over a decade, and it was very clear that that was an abusive conservatorship. They put an IUD in her that she did not want. So, there's that same thing where it's like, well, just because you're effectively sterilizing somebody, if just because they're mentally ill. And we've done that before. Again, back when they were putting ice picks in people's eyes, they were also sterilizing them. And,
and not to mention that's a painful process too. Like that insertion is
mm-hmm. I have not gone through it.
Me either, but I hear plenty of people talk about how
I have
painful.
Not heard a single good story. Like, as soon as I'm done having kids, I'm just going to have a hysterectomy. Like, what do I need it for? Get it out of there. It's just causing problems. Like, freaking A. So, but yeah, I did think that this study was interesting just because of that idea of, using stimulants. And I think also we get like, my Concerta is a controlled substance. And it's just ridiculous to me that like, I have to call around to these different pharmacies and ask if they have it in stock. And then if I'm like, okay, well, do you have Vyvanse or Adderall? Do you have like name brand Concerta? Which of these options do you have? But I sound like a huge like junkie because I'm like, which drug can I tell my doctor to write a prescription for? Because frankly, as far as I'm concerned, my doctor should at least have access to these supply levels and be able to say like, oh yeah, they're not making Concerta, but they're making Adderall. I'll switch you to this lower dose of Adderall for now. And then once they start making Concerta again, we can switch you back if you want or whatever. I don't care. Like, but my doctor doesn't know. He just sends the script over. And why would he, it's just like one of those things that has been on my mind lately. And I'm dreading having to make all these phone calls, basically.
Oh yeah. And two, I mean, I don't know if you struggle the same way that I do. I hate the thought that someone's going to think something poorly about me, even though they're never going to meet me. Or if they meet me, they're not going to really know who I am to think, oh, she's just a drug seeker or whatever. But still, that feeling is so heavy. And you have more valuable things to do with your time. You're a busy person who contributes to society. You have a great job, a relationship. Why are you spending hours upon hours? And if they say yes, then that's going to change again next month whenever you need to have a refill.
Exactly. That's the thing that I think is like stopping me from making these calls is like, what's the fucking point? Because if you're just not going to, like, I know that my current pharmacy has my Ritalin in stock because I take an instant release in the afternoons. And so I'm kind of like, maybe I should just have my doc issue me a script for just Ritalin and I'll just take that every 4 hours on work days. And like, whatever, I'll give up on the extended release option. But then it's like, okay, guaranteed other people are going to try that. And then in 2 months, I won't be able to find Ritalin. So like, what am I going to do? And so thankfully, I mean, I have, I go to therapy and I work on other things to help me try to manage my ADHD. But yeah, it's just.
I will say the generic form of Vyvanse has come out now. And so this month is the first month that I've tried it. I went from paying with insurance $85 to $15.
Oh my goodness.
So at least there's a larger supply because now we're not just for those who use Vyvanse and had trouble getting that drug. So now there's more on the market that we have access to currently.
That's good.
Yep. So just a little piece of happiness to add to like the frustration with medication for
That is good to
ADHD.
know. That will make me feel better because it's just also that like I'm not driving an hour. I'm not driving an hour to go to a pharmacy. Like I'm just not doing it. I work 5 days a week. Like I know who I am as a person. It's not going to happen. And the same thing is going on, like, because initially it was actually my partner, PK, his script was like, he's on a higher dosage than me. And they were like, yeah, we just don't have it, but we have it out in this other pharmacy, like 30 to 40 minutes away. And I was like, well, maybe they'll have mine in stock and you can just get like a script for 2 of my pills and just take that instead. And then they were like, well, we have 21 days of your 90-day supply. And I'm like, cool, I guess.
Yeah. And then you won't get your 90-day supply at the end of that 21 days.
So that was my question, because I was like, so what happens? And they were like, well, you just have to have a new script written after the 21 days. And so we'll see. But because I mean, it will show that I was only dispensed the 21 pills. So it's not
but on
like
the bottle, it says differently, which has been my experience and my dad's experience. But that could be I live in North Carolina. He lives in South Carolina. That could be an issue.
I'll check the pill box. Whatever. It's just all a nightmare. Regardless, I mean, yeah, it's just that thing where I'm like, at this point, it's not the end of the world, but if I've been applying to other jobs, so like if I change jobs, I don't really want to show up like raw dogging it. I'd like to show up like somewhat prepared to work.
I don't know. That may give you the edge. And they're like, this is our girl.
Yeah. This girl is tweaking.
Why didn't we have her earlier?
She does everything and also nothing. It's great.
And at a really fast pace.
But yeah. So anyway, that was the study that I just thought was interesting and worth looking into, because again, I think especially as time goes on, like you said, the political climate that we're in right now, I think we're going to keep having these questions of really genetic testing and the implications of that, and medical autonomy, I think. But
yeah, again, I completely agree with that, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes to. Like, are they going to be able to continue to not just do brain tissue of maybe a fetus that didn't make it to term and that was a stillbirth or whatever, or are they going to be able to do the zygotes, the embryos that maybe they're kind of getting at their checked out point where they're no longer viable, that they're going to be able to utilize that as that continues and IVF in general continues to grow? I don't know, but I'm excited to at least follow the science along with it and see what the process and the end results are and what they find out. I love this article that you sent, by the way.
Oh, good.
This was a good one.
It was I thought the article, which is also, of course, linked in our show notes. The Washington Post article was very easy to follow. It didn't overcomplicate things. And so I was using it a lot when I was reading the actual study to make sure that I was right in what I was reading and what I was taking away from it. But no, I thought it was a very, very interesting article. And I mean, anytime one of these studies comes out, I just love it, because I think it is so interesting. And that they were able to do all this in a petri dish is so cool. And to like actually see the connections being made, I've always thought was like, it's just wild that like you can watch it happen under a microscope. And it's not just like, it's also the same thing when like there's this show on Max called like How the Universe Works or something. And they were talking about the sun and like how energy from the sun like reaches us. And it's like a 800,000 year process from like the center of the sun just to the surface of the sun. And then once it reaches the surface, it takes 8 minutes to reach us. but they were like going through all these things. And I was like, yeah, but how did you figure that out? Like, you can't go into the sun. So like the
That's
whole
how
time.
That's how I was when I took physics a couple years ago. I was thinking when they were going through and gravity 9.87 times 10 to the, but I was like, how do they find and figure out that versus
Yes.
universal gravity, which is 6.67 times? How did you know this when we didn't even have technology back then, or
Oh,
and
I
is
know.
still relevant and it has not changed to this day? How brilliant of minds were those people back then, and the formulas. I loved physics, just to sit there and listen to concepts of even something is suction onto a wall, so there's force from the wall, there's force down, there's force up, there's force in, and how you have to come up with all the equations and how that's relevant to everything around it.
That's wild.
It's amazing.
It's
But my
It
brain
just
just
blew my
works that
mind.
way.
Like the thing with the sun, they were like, yeah, we look at it through this thing and it's like a grayscale image that's, I guess, live. And they're like, the ripples are like sound waves. And I was like, okay, still, how do you know what happens under that? Like, I'm still not following. Like, how did you figure this out? Like, what is the model that you created to be like, these are gamma rays, and that's why? And they were like, and that's why the Hulk turned into the Hulk, because they were gamma rays. And I was like, okay, gotcha. Gamma rays bad. Got it. But I was like, oh my God, this is wild. So when you can actually see the thing happen in the petri dish, I'm just like so blown away and captivated, because everything, like, I believe these scientists. Like, I don't not believe them. I just like, when you actually get to see it in action, I think it is so compelling. And it was like always the best part of science class for me, when you could actually like see it happening. Because otherwise it's just stories.
Right. And then you just believe it based on you have to.
Yeah. Or you become a flat earther and you don't believe it. So
I mean, at least I had that leg up with COVID, even though I went through so much with death at an exponential rate and having to witness that.
that's
I was like,
true.
no, I promise it's real. Cross my heart.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much. We're going to do one more episode. But in the meantime, where can people find you?
They can find me. I'm most active right now because I'm back in school finishing up prereqs for med school. But I do have a podcast, The Neurodivergent Nurse, which I have not recorded in a couple months, but there's plenty of episodes on there. But Instagram is where I am most active. I still have daily posts on there, whether it's something funny, whether it's tips for ADHD, ASD, any type of neurodivergency. And that's at The Neurodivergent Nurse as well on Instagram. And Threads, I just kind of jump in there every now and again too. Pretty much anywhere. Anywhere is the answer.
Yeah, no, I made a Threads for our podcast, and then like every so often I'll get a notification that's like, hey, you haven't logged into Threads in a while. I'm like, oh yeah, sure didn't.
It's at least a happy place though. I don't feel dirty after I'm on there for a while.
That's true. Also, welcome to our newest Patreon member, Amanda Martino. Thank you so much. If you want to join Amanda as a Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/thebarisAnkleHigh. We are on Instagram mostly, and our handle is @thebarisAnkleHigh. We're on the same handle on Threads intermittently, and on Facebook. Mostly everything I post to Instagram just gets automatically posted to Facebook. So if you want to really hang out with me, mostly because I run the socials, Instagram's the way to go. And a reminder, while Garrett is on maternity leave, which will be wrapping up at the end of this month, November, then during her maternity leave, all of our Patreon subscribers get ad-free episodes. So whether you're a $5 anklet or a $10 limbo champion, you get ad-free episodes. And limbo champions will get added to our close friends list on Instagram, where you see more behind the scenes stuff and maybe more of like the risque memes that I share to the podcast account. But in the meantime, don't sweat the genetic tests. I guess I'll say. Because the
And
bar.
we'll talk to you again in 5 years with the updates.
Yes. Because the bar is ankle high.